Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk more about the speed of recordings. I'm going to stick today with disc recordings because there's a variety of speeds, and I have talked before about some things with speeds of records. But there's a couple of things that I did not mention before that I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to stay away from the cylinders. The cylinders also have a myriad of speeds, and that's something we can talk about another time. But with the disc record, you have to understand at the very beginnings of the development of the disc with Berliner, there was a compromise between speed and quality. The acid-etched discs made by Berliner were not exactly smooth. They were a rough surface because of the acid etching, so to speak. So it did have an inherent noise. Now with a recording, the faster you play the recording, the better your quality will be. Hence the idea with those early recordings going at a higher rate of speed. They weren't doing 20 RPMs because that would be just dreadful. But if you think about it, if they were doing 20 RPMs, you'd have 10 minutes of music per se. But the quality would be so pathetic, it would be pretty much useless, and the surface noise would be really bad. And so they had that compromise. And they figured it out with the Berliners. They've 65, maybe 70 RPMs, give or take. There was no set science to it. They just wanted to go fast, and they kept generally in that area. Although there are some wild exceptions. Now you have to understand when the earliest discs were made, they were made mainly of hard rubber. Some of the early 5-inch Berliners. They were made in Germany for children's toys, mainly out of a hard rubber substance. And Berliner's earliest recordings commercially were hard rubber as well, but they were problematic as they had a tendency to flatten out in areas, and you would lose your groove, so to speak, in the record. And that's why something very important was developed, but would also change the industry, and that was the development of the formula for making 78 records, so what we would call shellac records, which have a element of hard rubber in them, but have many other things, graphite, etc. This was formulated by a company called Doranoid. Now the Doranoid company was located in Newark, New Jersey. And not only did they come up with the formula for the ingredient for making that Berliner record more practical where they wouldn't lose their grooves, but they also stamped out the Berliner records. And there was a very good working relationship between the Berliner gramophone and Doranoid. And I think it's unfortunate because we really don't hear about the Doranoid company much, and the fact that they were so important in the formation of what the 78 record would become. Now, once they started using this new material, it was not as smooth as the hard rubber, oddly enough. But it was hard, and it kept the groove. And if you think about it, that for the next 50 years, that formula would go pretty much unchanged. It was a really pretty cool thing that they developed. Now, in those early recordings, of course, Berliner records, 60, 70, 75, varies in speed, but they're all over the ballpark. There was no set, organized speed for Berliners. Zonophone, pretty much the same. In 1899, with the beginning of Zonophone, which unfortunately a lot of the early Zonophones were just Berliners with the information taken off them. So their speeds were just about as wacky as the Berliners. It's once we start getting into these other companies that we start seeing some formulation of speed, but also a wanton disregard of it as well. And once you come up with the consolidated talking machine company with Eldridge Johnson, once again the speeds are 65, 70, more or less around there. Not always. There seems to be no general rule. And then by the time we get into the climax record, which is the pre-Columbia, once again we have speeds all over the ballpark. I have climax records that play at 60 RPMs. I have ones that are playing at 80 RPM. I mean, there's a wide spread of speeds. And once someone came up with the idea of 78 as a standard speed, that became the concept, but rarely the result. Often it was by accident that a record was at 78 RPM. So all of these early recordings required a machine that could play music at about 20, well, let's just put it this way, from about 58 RPMs to about 80 RPMs. You needed that because your records were pretty much within that category. There was no set consistency. And once Columbia became the Columbia Records in 1902, and they were in a hurry to replace many of the climax recordings, they were working overtime to represent or re-record a number of items for Columbia with an announcement saying Columbia Band or Columbia Record, whatever it may be. And they were in such a hurry to do this that many of these records would go through speed changes of bizarre amounts. And you'll notice it. Quality control went right down the cliff in that 1902 period of the remakes of a lot of the climax things because they were working, as I said, overtime trying to saturate the catalog with the recordings that said the name of the company as it was after like August of 1902. Another thing I find kind of fascinating, even as we move along and move up, and we get to, more advanced Columbias and, of course, the Victor Talking Machine Company, one would think that at this point a consistent speed would be reached. And, well, that did not happen either. Columbia records were advertised at playing 80 RPM. Well, many of them are close to 80, but some of them are not. Victor was advertised at playing at 78 RPM. Several are, but many are not. There were recording engineers who had specific thoughts about certain speeds. There were recording engineers that said Billy Murray sounds best at like 74 RPMs. Why? Well, the problem was they were playing him at 78, so he didn't quite sound as how he recorded. Henry Burr, same thing. There were recording engineers saying that he sounds better at about 74, 75. Now, if you play that at 78 or 80, the tonal quality is going to be quite different. And sometimes Billy Murray comes across as being very nasal, and Henry Burr comes off very, very high. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're playing the records at the wrong speed. Even with Caruso, I mean, his early G&T recordings were 71 RPM. The ones made in later 1902 are like 67 RPM. And even the ones that were made, the Matinata and whatever, those were at like 73, 74 RPMs. And when he came to Victor, it's interesting, the first release of Caruso's recordings in the United States with the recordings he made at Carnegie Hall are 78.26, which is perfect. never quite do that again for a while. I mean, most of his recordings will be in the 75 and 76 RPM arena. Some of them will be a little faster. Some of them are up to like 80. But they will never go back down to the 60s. It would always stay in the mid 70s, 74, 75. In the later years, there were some experimental ones that seemed to be going at about 73 RPM that were transcribed to 78 RPM. But there really did not seem to be a certain consistency in recording. And it didn't seem to be that very important. Although it was stressed in all the catalogs, our records are recorded at 78 RPM. That's a bold, out-and-out lie. Columbia said 80 RPM. That's a bold, out-and-out lie. The Edison records, the Edison disc records, were recorded. They would tune their recordings. They had special tuning records to have the proper speed set, and they would record at 80 RPM. Probably the most consistent in speed are the Edison records, although there are times that they're not right either. It's an interesting thing. You know, the people we think we know what they sounded like actually sound a little different at times. And if we had an electric turntable that played at 78 RPM, it did not care if a record had been recorded at 72 RPM, it was going to play it at 78, and therefore it would sound quite a bit different. It's interesting sometimes when you sit there and look through the recordings. Like, I have a recording of George Washington Johnson, and he's doing one of his recordings, and I was kind of shocked as I went down and kept lowering the speed. I finally found it was playing right around 60 RPMs, and that was correct. And I said, that's amazing, isn't it? And an early Columbia, like 19.2, with a brass grommet in the center, which kind of tells you it's 19.2. By 19.3, they're not using those brass grommets anymore. Another thing is that the Victor records, all the way up until the beginnings of the electrical era, once they started using electrically powered recording lathes, they'd have a consistent speed and it would be set and would stay the same all the time. Until that time, it was a matter of guesswork. And there was no true scientific thought put into speed. Very much like much of the other things with those early machines. There was no mathematical principle in closed horn Victrolas. Every one was slightly different a little bit, and each one had a sound very much unique to itself. Sometimes they got it head on, sometimes they were off a little bit, and the sound never seemed to work quite right. It wasn't until the orthophonic Victrola, which had a horn that was mathematically designed, that things changed drastically. So these are just some ramblings and thoughts about the speed of records. It's always been a compromise, until, let's say, vinyl comes out, and vinyl changes things because it's a very smooth surface. But with that rough, gritty material designed and invented by the Duranoid company, records had to go at a speed that would be a good compromise between the speed and the quality. Unfortunately, no one seemed to agree what that speed would be, and it wouldn't be till the latter 1920s that a consistency was finally achieved. Thank you.